We'll now go into we don't know if anyone else is going to come back, but what you have to say is too important for us not to make the record complete. And so in spite of the fact we neither have a speaker, nor are we well organized and with adult leaders, this committee will attempt to do that. So I'm going to follow up with a couple of questions, but if there are things you want to get out that come up from previous questions and so on, we're gonna deal with this like an open forum to a great extent, and if other members come in, we'll recognize them as they come in. I want to ask you a broad question, and that is, if China goes unchecked on its current trajectory, what do you believe will be the result to American enterprise? And then the flip side of it is, if we are to act with legislation, regulations, and procedures, what are the most important among them, other than money, which is usually the answer that we get first? So we'll go in, starting with Mr. Sheldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll constrain my answer to just a couple of topics that already came up this morning. First, I wanted to talk about promoting better defenses for people in small business. I think that was a really productive exchange. Just wanted to add a couple points. One is that it is the case that sometimes cybersecurity technologies just operate better at scale. In addition to being costly, it just helps to be able to build a big, mature security program that can operate 24/7 by 365. So one thing that we encourage for policymakers to do is think about how to make accessible things like managed security services, which can kind of bring down that level of maturity that you only usually find in large companies down to very small companies. So that's a thing that I would encourage for us. And I think it's worth exploring how we can use tax incentives or other tax mechanisms to be able to promote the adoption of those types of technologies in small businesses. And then the second thing, you asked a great question earlier this morning from my point of view on stress testing and thinking about how to get platforms to be able to govern the sort of areas of risk under their control. And I think that over the past 15 years, there's been an interesting change in terms of how we've thought about trying to do that. If you go back a long time ago, there was some discussion around using internet service providers as the sort of enforcement point to try and protect individual companies or individuals. And then more recently, we've seen some interest in getting cloud service providers to do the same sort of thing. Of course, in both those cases, there's a countervailing interest in protecting individuals' privacy and company interests as well. And that's why the system that we have now is largely predicated on people trying to defend themselves. There's a thing that's happening within the US government right now, and it's being driven by CISA, which I think is a really interesting and important way to square the circle. And that is to try and get more concepts like secure by design and secure by default adopted by major platform providers. And the idea behind that is to ensure that you have a situation where companies are accountable for delivering secure services to different users, and that so that vulnerable users aren't the ones bearing the responsibility solely for their own defense. And I think that that's a really important concept that we can help promote over time. Thanks.
I'm excited to answer this question. Actually, at lunch, we were talking about how he wished he could have answered the small business one, sir, so that was great. I want to start with the first one about unchecked. I wonder what'll break first, the Chinese Communist Party or the American economy. I am not an optimist for China's future at all. When you have a nation of 1.4 billion that suppresses basic human freedoms and women's right to even have a productive dialogue in their society, that shows you things aren't going well. But usually authoritarian regimes are their most dangerous when they're at their death's door. And that means that they will use the competition with the United States as a way to possibly rally around the party, right? To basically come at us at every means possible. And I think you've laid out a number of those scenarios, both very creative ways of tying us up legally, accelerating economic warfare, accelerating political warfare, getting us stuck in arms races that are important, but ultimately self-defeating from a net assessment standpoint. Now, how do we compete in that, and what can Congress in particular do to compete in that? Because I do think, you know, our service members are ready for that challenge. They've been planning for some time. I think it gets back to what we're talking about. How do you promote innovative new companies without over-regulating them? And I 100% agree. This is not a money question. This is a smart governance question and creating that kind of playing field. So whether it's whatever the mechanism, credits, subsidies, there's better experts on that to figure out the right calibration for small businesses and universities so that you make it harder for the Chinese Communist Party to get in. You alter the cost-benefit calculation. I think tech standards are more than just secure by design. We need to start sending our top diplomats to the International Technical Union to negotiate new standards in as technology comes online. I do also think the stress testing, I don't know if Congress can mandate that, but whatever instrument you could use to kind of push for more than just cyberstorm, large-scale games.
Just in case you thought it was a made-up question, the concept of how we would do it is to rein in the Federal Trade Commission by creating a safe harbor. Almost every company of any size, their greatest fear is somebody will hack in, some employee will misuse their own authority, and then they will be under a consent decree for years and a very expensive oversight. Even happens to very small companies, sometimes putting them out of business. So one of the questions we've had in the past, and again, not completely within our jurisdiction, was the Federal Trade Commission has a great ability, except if you're in government, to beat the living hell out of you after you've already been hurt by some sort of an event, but they do nothing or virtually nothing to tell you what to do to prevent it. They tell you, well, use best standards, you know, and it's like, well, if it fails, by definition, they're going to say you didn't meet whatever the best standards were. Safe haven of quote, recognized stress test and, if you will, cloud, compliant, would seem to be where the government can say, if you do this, we will give you, even if something bad happens, and eventually it will, because nothing's perfect, we give you the safe haven. Safe haven from litigation, safe haven from your own government. Doesn't mean you don't have to fix, doesn't mean you don't have to make people whole, but that was where we saw the soft hand.
Yeah.
The late Colin Powell always said that the way he got problems solved, including in Haiti, was he went down there and explained to the dictator that the carrot he was offering is if he left, he wouldn't use the stick. That is sort of what we're saying, is we already have a stick.
Yeah.
Let's find a way to tell people that if they meet standards, we won't be allowed to use the stick.
So, final point to build off that, I think there's something also then to pooling cyber statistics and having transparent data. So we for years have had the ability to have near misses reported anonymously to the FAA that lets aviation safer. If we don't start pooling cyber statistics and anonymizing them, we're not going to have a sound set of data to actually be able to price risk. It'd be like trying to run the American economy without accurate inflation data, accurate GDP data, accurate unemployment data. And then the last would be visibility in supply chains. And I defer to other folks on that, but how do I make sure that what we produce and is patent protected isn't being bought by front companies and given to our competitors?
Chairman Issa, back to your first question about if China goes unchecked. I think as we look back on the end of the Cold War, there's one storyline that says the American economy bankrupted the USSR. And so you can analogize to a world where China tries to fight a war of economic attrition with all the waste, and abuse they can try to get into our system through cyber attacks, theft of, intellectual property, et cetera. So that's, I think, a very bleak side of the story, and we definitely have to keep investing in the institutions and government that protect us from that. On the more positive front, I think our public sector employees need more help. There is now advanced persistent threats that they face every day. The volume of information that they're trying to process on behalf of us all is orders of magnitude larger than what we imagined or had to deal with as young people. And they don't have AI-ready data. They just have data. So we really need to start working on the more than 700 AI-related initiatives that the agencies and departments have identified already, and they need to start getting experience around it, and especially how to apply modern security practices to this AI-ready data that they're going to create and the new applications that they're going to build to deliver better services to us all.
In terms of reigning in China, let me speak to what I think I know best. You're not going to stop the informal technology transfer that's happening. It's been going on since the 1800s by some measure. It's become part of the national psyche. And it's not going to go away, unlike Japan and South Korea and even the United States, which once they became developed nations, technologically proficient, they stopped borrowing from abroad.
But you're saying informal, so you're saying more universities who publish what they've done and then are shocked that it suddenly disappears into Chinese use.
It's a term of art. Informal, extra-legal transfer, the kinds of, anything that we don't want to happen is being transferred.
So you're talking about theft?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, because obviously one of the things that we really do, we publish in New England Journal of Medicine all kinds of things that are very valuable. They cost a lot, and we do in fact create a take it if you want it environment. But you're talking about over and above that. There's always been somebody sneaking in, getting you to hire one of their people for 6 months to get to know and then run back.
We identify three major categories of technology transfer: legal, illegal, and extra-legal, which splits the difference. Extra-legal is, we don't know whether it's legal or not because we're not observing it. We can, but we don't. We're not equipped to do it. Which gets to my point, you won't stop the informal tech transfer, but you can get out in front of it with the right amounts of data. Chinese scientists, administrators, particularly when they're speaking in Chinese, although they know darn well they're being monitored, they don't feel it in their gut. I'm sure they're listening to me saying this right now and shaking their heads. But that's the truth. They say the darndest things in their open source materials. And it can all be captured. We've run pilot programs to do that. So, you can understand what's going to happen in the areas of technology transfer, by identifying their needs, first of all. What do they need? What do they need to acquire that they can't develop on their own? And then also identifying beforehand and monitoring the venues through which they fill these needs, and it's all doable. As far as the AI development effort, ditto for that. I can't say that I can recommend any policies for how to mitigate it. I'd be speculating, but what I can do is say emphatically that if you want to understand where they're going, you can't do it without data. And we don't have that data at present. We have snippets here and there from which we can extrapolate. We don't have a whole picture.
I've got a follow-up question. Currently, what they call the BIS controls at Department of Commerce. It's a major undersecretary position. It controls export. It's your export control, if you will. But it's an export control for hardware, effectively. And when you look at software, things available on the internet, there isn't, in fact, a specific agency, and that agency is not charged with, for example, saying that this technology or time on this computer is, in fact, a national asset. So currently, if I'm sitting in China and I simply rent time on a generative AI computer, if you will, I can actually take what somebody else has developed, and it's fine. I'm just buying it. And yet that could allow me to develop some of the most sinister items, even if I didn't have the capability in my home country. And I'm speaking of China, but I'm also speaking of non-state players anywhere in the world who simply have somebody that's willing to give them the dollars. What concern do you think we have, and how should we thwart it with, and I'm including non-state actors because I think we've concentrated on China, that's the primary, but I think this is a broader question of export controls on our AI capability. We'll go the other direction this time.
I'll take a first crack at that. I've seen so-called military technology control lists come and go. I don't personally think that there's much to be gained by putting together a list of technologies, hardware or software. that are, quote, at risk because they're almost always obsolete the time that they're published. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have to do something. You have to identify what you care about and what you don't care about, so where you know what to emphasize. But the bigger issue here, and you put your finger on it, is this whole notion of basic science. Where not stuff that's already patented, not hardware, not machinery, not weapons, but the technologies that are underlying that as they're in the developmental stage. We for a long time as a country have drawn a line there. Correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, but my understanding is that we have pretty much let that be open market, free reign. It's not something we want to restrict. Now, the National Science Foundation, for example, for the first time is starting to take that into account, that maybe we need not to be so open in this area. That's the U.S. side. I can tell you, again, that China understands this perfectly well, and they identify in their open pronouncements the need for them to access technology while it's still in the early stages and while it's still basic science. The one thing they don't really do well is basic science, and for that reason they're eager to acquire it.
If I could add to that, I would say it's important to have this security mindset and overlay exist within each of our agencies and departments, especially as they think about the types of data and types of applications we'll need. Each agency and department is continuing to go through a digital transformation in many respects. And they ultimately are closest to how to properly protect and control this data. I agree with my co-panelists that we want to preserve an open society where people can study what they need to study, learn what they want to, and then create the inventions that we need next. But we should now be mindful of the fact that there's an active, persistent effort to try to steal all of that from us. And so organizations like the Department of Commerce, organizations like CFIUS and others really need to be close to this problem, and we need to rely upon them to come up with the right regulations and rulemaking because they're so close to the right disciplines and domains that they manage.
Chairman, I think in two extremes, you've kind of heard it. You either can lock it all down, in which case the cost is you will be less innovative just because there's fewer people exchanging information, or you can completely open it up, right? And then you buy innovation through letting people exchange ideas, but with the clear risk of slippage into other nefarious actors. Obviously, those are extremes, and the challenge of legislation is how to find something in the middle. And I think the key to that something in the middle should always be an eye on trusting our ability to out-innovate our adversaries. The fact that they aren't good at basic research should mean we double down in basic research. And then separately, probably find a way, which would be outside of this committee, to basically go after it through Title 50 means where give them indirect costs for stealing certain things. I just don't think export controls will work in a global supply chain as well as they have maybe historically.